Yes, we are going there. How can we not go there, right? How can we not go there? This is so central. This issue strikes me as so central to what's going on in the book. And it strikes others as well as so central to what's going on in the book. For example, one of those others, Emily Shook, in Remasculating the Vampire, Conceptions of Sexuality in the Undead, from Rossetti's Proserpine to Myers, Cullen. And this is what Shuck has to say about the book. Quote, while Lucy is penetrated by not only Dracula, but also with the blood of three other men by way of the transfusions, you will recall, which I hope reminds you of the George Eliot story where we also have a blood transfusion going on. This was a fairly new technology at that time, fairly new medical uh, method, medical um, procedure at that time. And so it's interesting how it shows up in these books. Well, Lucy's penetrated not only by Dracula, but also the blood of three other men. Her husband, Arthur, one-ups them all. He achieves the ultimate penetration when, Shuck says, after her undead rebirth into a nightmare, a devilish mockery, you remember where she's turned into this kind of licentious sexual adventurer, he stakes her and thus relieves her of her undead nature, the stake, as you will recall, through her heart. Driven by Arthur, as we have already seen, as we talked about the book, or at least as I have talked about it. Well, I believe that was actually, yeah, you were talking about it in a discussion board item that I think some of you chose to write about. Afterwards, after the staking, Arthur, quote, looked too at the staked body. I guess the men are gathered around her looking at the staked body. And then something kind of interesting happens. A glad, strange light broke over his face and dispelled altogether the gloom of horror that lay upon it. Now, Arthur could be smiling. We want to see this as a smile, this glad, strange light breaking over his face, because his beloved will now be resting with the angels, as Dr. Van Helsing claims, instead of haunting the earth with her undead brethren. But Shuck continues, his reaction is suspiciously happy, considering the horror of staking one's wife, or anybody else for that matter, resembling more closely the, quote, Shuck says, after-sex glow that would result from human intercourse. It also demonstrates, this glad, strange light breaking upon his face, according to Shuck, also demonstrates the restoration of the natural order, as conceived by, according to Shuck, this fairly conservative Victorian document, for all of its extravagant, phenomena that it records in the story itself, in the plot, it's nevertheless, and it's hard, according to Shuck, a very conservative Victorian document with respect to sexual politics. It is Lucy's husband, Arthur, who should be penetrating her. Thus, when it is Lucy's husband, Arthur, who does penetrate her, though in this displaced way by way of the stake, what we have is a resituating, according to Shuck, of the human masculine body as in control of the feminine undead one, even if it's only done kind of in a sense symbolically by way of the stake, it's nevertheless done. Again, according to Shuck. Well, what do you think? What do you think of this claim offered by Shuck? Let's clarify the claim, of course, before I ask that question another time. Do the math. Staking. I mean, I think it's clear. I think it is clear to you, but I want to go ahead and make absolutely certain that it is clear to you. Staking is a kind of violent male sexual conduct. Staking, according to Shuck, what relieves her, Lucy, of her undead, unnatural hypersexual nature, returning her to, quote, the natural order where she is not hypersexual, but is in fact properly demure on Victorian standards. That's what's natural to women and to the feminine, according to Victorians, according to Shuck. But now, Lucy's dead, really most sincerely dead. I guess I could have sung that, right, if I really wanted to quote the coroner. The coroner from a very famous American movie, that American film that came out in the 1930s. I'll bet you know which one I'm talking about. Which has its own strange little gothic dimensions, I think, in certain ways. It's got a witch in it, right? Some of you may be writing about this on the final exam, Part B. And I'm not going to say too much about it here. Then again, I have asked you to quote this this film. I think you will agree that the book Dracula would appear to stage a rapprochement, which that's a French word just meaning a kind of approach, two things coming together. The book would seem to stage this coming together of sexuality and mortality, hence my title, Sex and Death, would seem to be coming together in this book. The book seems to bring them together, not to mention sexuality and morality. Okay? Yeah, maybe that's enough for now. Let's go on to the next panel. Sexuality and mortality, sexuality and morality, men and women, also men and men. Maybe more so, men and men, more about men and men than about men and women. It's about men and women, so it can be about men and men as opposed to vice versa. Some have said such. Here's another critical comment. That's from John Allen Stevenson, who wrote a fairly celebrated essay on the sexuality of Dracula, subtitled The Sexuality of Dracula. Quote, that Dracula concerns competition between men and women, but between men, for women can hardly be questioned, John Allen Stevenson asserts. Passages like these, he's just quoted a couple of passages, can be multiplied almost indefinitely, but what is the nature of that competition? A good question, but really? Dracula concerns competition between men for women? So, competition between men for women? Well, yes. Cutting to the chase, go to chapter 23, which in the Puffin, which for all I know, some of you went and got that or ordered it. I think that's on our original syllabus. But of course, the Gutenberg edition, the Project Gutenberg ebook of Dracula, which I think I put up for you guys to go and much less expensively procure. If you will turn to chapter 23, you're going to find this passage, right? And I'll leave you to find it on your own, and I'll just press on at this point. The community of men, you remember the Elizabeth Showalter phrase? The community of men, she is, of course, talking about the Strange Case. Here in Dracula is gathered at Dracula's house in Piccadilly when Big Daddy, C. Stevenson, returns and finds them. Big Daddy, of course, being Dracula himself, comes and finds these home invaders in the dining room of all places. And here's what we read. Competition between men for women. It would be impossible to describe the expression of hate and baffled malignity of anger and hellish rage which came over the Count's face in this moment when he sees them in his dining room. His waxen hue became greenish yellow by the contrast of his burning eyes, and the red scar on his forehead showed on a pallid skin like a palpitating wound. The next instant, with a sinuous dive, he swept under Harker's arm, ere his blow could fall, and grasping a handful of the money from the floor, dashed across the room, threw himself at the window. Amid the crash and glitter of the falling glass, he tumbled into the flagged area below. Through the sound of shivering glass, I could hear the ting of the gold as some of the sovereigns fell on the flagging. I can't help but pause right here and say, isn't this so typical? As you get a little bit older, maybe take some other English classes, read more English fiction, you will see that there's no national literature in which sovereigns falling on the flagging are going to make a louder ting than amongst the British. So attentive to, shall we say, money, okay, for want of a better phrase. And the economic dimension of human existence is something that the British rarely overlook when they tell a story or what have you. But let's see what happens. We ran over and saw him spring unhurt from the ground. Of course, this is one of the men. This is Dr. Seward, who's narrating. He, Dracula, rushing up the steps, crossed the flagged yard and pushed open the stable door. There he turned and spoke to us. You think to baffle me, you, with your pale faces all in a row, like sheep in a butcher's. You shall be sorry yet, each one of you. You think you have left me without a place to rest, but I have more. My revenge has just begun. I spread it over centuries, and time is on my side. The girls that you all love are mine already. Now let's just pause right there. Don't go any further. Competition between men for women. Well, it's like, we've already seen that the guys were in competition for Lucy, right? Now, we don't have that for Mina, who Dracula's now after, but in a sense, you could say he's competing with Parker for Mina, we've already got this sense that men are in competition for women. It's compounded when Dracula comes on the scene and steals Lucy, as it were, away from Arthur, who has won her from Quincy and from Seward, right? And we have a version of the same thing kind of going on right now, kind of symbolically, as it were. We even have Van Helsing on the scene, who's taken up a not a romantic, uh, posture with respect to Mina, but is another man who seems to very much love this girl, your girls that you all love. And so this Dracula's right. I mean, Dracula in some ways is all about men. Dracula's a novel is in to a degree all about men who seem to be trying various ways to get the girl, right? It's in a very strange gothic way, kind of your traditional love story of young men, and maybe not just young men, trying to win the hand of right in these traditional stories of the prettiest girl, the prettiest girls. You girls, your girls that you all love are mine already. In this moment, Dracula is suggesting to them, notice he includes, it's plural, he's including Lucy in that plural uh, term, girls, and declaring that he's already won. He's already beaten them. And no matter what they do at this point, he's already kind of gotten it. He's already gotten the victory chalked up, right? Now, okay, so there we have it. There we have the basic claim, competition of men for women, between men for women. But what about this other claim that is offered, right, by our literary critic from an earlier panel, that it's as much about a competition between of men, not men for women, yes, but competition between men, that being the more powerful motive. It's not so much that you really want the girl, it's that you want to beat the guy. You want to beat the other guys. And the girl is just your means to do that. Is this a book that registers that central ambition even more than the central romantic ambition that we have been giving voice or giving some attention to up to this point? Notice what happens next, what Dracula says next, right? Your girls that you all love are mine already. Now notice after the semicolon. And through them, you and others shall yet be mine. My creatures to do my bidding and to be my jackals when I want to feed. Bah, with a contemptuous sneer. He passed through the door and we heard the rusty bolt creak as he fastened it behind him. You see this here, don't you? Some very strong evidence that the girls are only interested as a medium through which you can work to get, in this story, the men into your control, right? And turn them into your creatures, to kind of own them. You know what I'm saying? I mean, we hear this sometimes in, when people in sports talk about having defeated someone, they say, well, we own them, right? You'll hear that, or, you might recall the Boston Red Sox pitcher who some years ago said Yankee fans would never let him forget about this. He said, the Yankees are my daddy. You've just gotten beaten by the Yankees. And he said, the Yankees are my daddy. Well, the big daddy here, you see the point there that a father sort of owns his son is kind of the idea that's being given voice in that moment. And don't we have that in a sense, some suggestion of that nature here on display, that the big daddy, of course, here is Dracula. And in a way, he owns them. You and others shall yet be mine, right? Through them, you and others shall yet be mine. In a sense, he said a few moments ago that you already are mine, right? You already are my creatures, which is like what you would build or what you would make if you were a father. I guess you would say that your sons are your creatures. So we see that. I mean, here, to put it that way, it's like a relationship between a father and a son makes it sound benign. And it's not malign here. Sorry, it's not benign. It's malign. It's malicious. Quote, with a contemptuous sneer, he says this, right? It's extremely violent and nasty, but it's a version of the same, right? Of the same sort of relationship that you would see with a father and a son, given very twisted and dark form here in this book. back to Stevenson. And this is going to be some heady material, and I don't expect you to talk about this, but I wanted to run it by you anyway. Stevenson says, quote, that Dracula concerns competition between men for women can hardly be questioned. Passages like these can be multiplied almost indefinitely. But what is the nature of that competition? Certainly a number of readers have agreed on one interpretation as they would have it. The horror we feel in contemplating Dracula is that his actions, when stripped of displacement and disguise, are fundamentally incestuous, and that Stoker's novel is finally a rather transparent version of the primal horde theory Freud advanced only about 15 years after publication of this novel in a book by Freud called Totem and Taboo. According to this interpretation, the Count, undeniably long in the tooth, attempts to hoard all the available women, leaving the younger generation, his sons, no recourse but to rise up and kill the wicked father, thus freeing the women for themselves. The novel does, Stevenson goes on, concern how one old man struggles with four young ones and another old but good man, Dr. Van Helsing, an oldie but a goodie, for the bodies and souls of two young women. But to call that strife interfamilial, or to say that all the characters, including Dracula, are linked as members of one family, seems to be more of a tribute to the authority of psychoanalysis as a form of literary criticism, enjoys among literary critics, than it is an illuminating description of Stoker's narrative. And it would be interesting to get into that question, but I think it's very complex, very abstract, and very difficult. And I think you can tell Stevenson is not fully on board with this reading of Dracula. And I think he's got some complex reasons for why he wants to back away from it a bit. But I don't think it will do us too much harm to imagine that there's a kind of strange familial thing going on here without quite committing ourselves to seeing the story as being all about incest. Okay. And all that incest taboo and whatnot. I mean, I agree with Stevenson. That seems to be something of a stretch. Nevertheless, if we imagine that, one of the big ambitions of the book, or one of the deepest fears given voice by the book, is of a dad. I keep calling him a big daddy, like an old father who has outlived his time. Okay. And is keeping his sons from growing up and becoming, fully adult and becoming something other than sons, becoming fathers in their own right, by in fact, right, finding wives and having children. I think that is in some ways could be seen as a very profound Victorian fear to which the book is giving voice, right? This fear of the past. I think we've seen this in some of the other books that we've read. I'm thinking of Drood, for example. Not just Drood, but there are a few other stories as well where we could perhaps see some evidence of this, which is that the past some embodiment of the past could refuse to go away and could in various ways prevent us from really living, okay? Could be one of the fears that the book is giving voice to. This is the opposite of the fear that, in fact, the future is coming too soon and the past is all getting swallowed up with all this innovation and this shock of the new that displaces the past and displaces tradition. That's a very different fear. And it's something that maybe you can see in certain books. I think especially when you move into the next period beyond the Victorian. The Victorians seemed to be a little bit more afraid that what was going to happen is that we weren't going to really come into our own as fully human beings to the extent that we allowed an extremely rich, at this point, past to constitute us, right? Too uncritically and too fully. And in some ways, this story is, I think, a kind of displaced version of that fear. Well, that's enough for this video, and for those of you who have chosen this item, good luck on the exam by way of this video, which I think I'm hoping will prompt all kinds of good ideas on your part. Take care. Bye-bye.